To you. I appreciate the invitation. Thank you very much, Helen. Thank you for the introduction, David. I appreciate that very much too. So this is my first time at the CES, and hopefully you'll enjoy the work that I'm doing. I had a choice to make. And one of the things I thought about, well, I could present a paper that has been thoroughly workshopped and it's close to publication, and so I know all the answers and I know all the questions that are going to arise, and so I will come off looking kind of good, with this polished paper. And then I thought, well, maybe I can do a paper on New Zealand, right? Because I'm studying New Zealand climate issues right now, and I could do something on New Zealand so everybody would understand that. And I thought, well, maybe that's kind of boring because you know so much about New Zealand. So I said, no, let's reject that. So I said to myself, well, let me take a paper that I've never presented to any audience before. So this is a first time. This is what we call a virgin paper, all right? And so it's probably full of errors and mistakes, but that's the benefit of being here, is that I want to hear from you to comment on what we've come up with so far. And all of this will help improve the paper. As all of you know, the first draft of a paper looks almost nothing like the final publication. I'm sure you've all been through that yourselves, right? You go through these drafts and you get the reviews and you go back and forth. So it takes some time. So this is very much the first presentation. There's the title, Heterogeneous ESG Impacts Through Actions Directed at Primary and Secondary Stakeholders. I'll come to describe what that actually means and what we do shortly. My authors are Florian and Felix. They're from Ingolstadt in Germany. And if you know Germany, Ingolstadt is the home of Audi. It's kind of like I call it like the Detroit of Germany. It's very much an industrial town, and most people will have some link to the Audi factory. So Felix is still in Ingolstadt, and Florian is now at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland. And University of Lausanne actually has a pretty stellar finance and management group. If you look at the list of faculty, they've got a pretty solid group, very research oriented. So he's working with quite a number of people in that part of the world. I'm fortunate to be able to work with him. He's a beginning sort of younger assistant professor, but he's doing really well. And we met a couple of years ago at a EAA Congress. And it's one of these chance meetings where you run into somebody and you see eye to eye, right? You realize you've got a lot in common. And I'm a senior, he's junior, but we're all of a sudden we've had a lot of things to talk about. And so this is really our second sort of major paper. We've already got one that's quite close to the publication, but this is our second one. I will move that on. Okay, so try it now. There we go. Okay. So just to prove we have a paper, here's the first page. So we actually have a paper, and I can make that available for those that are interested. So there's our paper, and it's the same title here. So if you look at this issue here on sustainable investing in the larger area of research, there's quite a few unresolved issues. All right. And a lot of these issues have been debated for like years and years and years. And you'd wondered why, after all that debate, a lot of them are still not yet resolved. And just to kind of give you like a flavor of some of the unresolved issues, people would agree there's monetary and social impacts, right? But as to where they are and how they arise and why they occur, we're sort of a little less sure about that. A lot of the literature has a investor focus, right, in terms of the investor being the main stakeholder. But if you think more beyond that, there's many, many stakeholders, right? Not just the creditors and the employees, but all of those folks outside of the boundaries of the organization, the community and at large and so forth. There's been, I think, an overemphasis just on the investor stakeholder and not the wider range. And if you think about stakeholders, you can think that stakeholder groups tend to have different preferences. They're not all the same. You know, some are, just to simplify it, some are much more interested in monetary payoffs or monetary outcomes. Others want social outcomes. They want a better world. They want the company to be more socially responsible and so forth. So we look at that as saying stakeholders have different preferences for outcomes, right? And if you look at the literature, some studies will use the term preferences, some studies will use the term interests and so forth, but we look at them as kind of much representing the sort of inherent beliefs that stakeholders have in what they want the firm to do or what they want the firm to achieve as outcomes. So we look at those, and our view is, again, a kind of an overriding assumption of this paper, is that those beliefs are heterogeneous. All right. And so given the heterogeneous preferences, right, it would seem logical to me, hopefully to you, that we'd get heterogeneous outcomes, right? The preferences are going to determine or be influential on the outcomes. So that's what we're looking at. Now we go to a very well-researched literature, and that is, what is the link between ESG and CFP, corporate financial performance, right? And so you've probably all seen lots of studies like that, and somebody will say, well, if we're good on the environment, we'll get good financial returns. That's a positive relation. Others will say, it's probably not much of a relation at all. And some will say, no, wait a minute. If you emphasize environmental issues, that's going to hurt the bottom line. And so you get a negative relation. So that research is all over the board. And there's quite a well-known study by Freed et al. You may be familiar with that. They looked at 2,000 studies. That's how many studies have been done on this ESG CFP relation. And so they come out and say, well, about 48% are indicative of a positive relation, right? And then looking at the figures here, and then 10.7 no, 23 neutral, 18 mixed. So if you add the neutral and the mixed together, that's 41%, right? So that 41% could actually be consistent with the view of this paper that is simply representing heterogeneous outcomes, right? There shouldn't necessarily always be a positive relation. And so these studies, and again, but if you look at this work, you don't really see this notion that we can explain the variation by what I call, or we propose, the heterogeneous beliefs. So just to look at this is the same study. Each dot is a study, basically. And you can see there that in the early days, they were positive. And as we move to the present, there's more diversity in the outcomes, right? And so you can think of the studies around the zero correlation line and just above or just below as being indicative of the fact that stakeholders have heterogeneous preferences because they're generating heterogeneous outcomes. So we think that we can turn that study sort of upside down almost to be supportive of the ideas that we're looking at in this paper. So So the literature is quite developed in a way. And some of the studies here I've listed. Max Clarkson is probably like the grandfather of all of this, and he came up with this notion that there are two general types of stakeholders, right, which we call primary and secondary stakeholders. We'll come to that definition in a minute. And so some of these studies here that I've mentioned have taken the Max Clarkson sort of definition and produced results which seem to be consistent with that definition, right? Galbraith, that's Australian data. The Goldstein one is more of a theory paper that talks about price discovery. And the argument in that paper is that price discovery is slower when you have ESG preferences over financial preferences. That's the sort of the message of that paper. Some of these others are simply talking about share value. And they're saying, well, you have more value of the shares when there's a primary emphasis, and the share price or the share value is lower when you have a secondary emphasis. And so, but it's all about sort of financial outcomes. There's nothing in here that pits the financial outcomes against the non-financial outcomes, right? And that's sort of one of the things we're doing here. So going back to the definition, this is the Clarkson definition. With the primaries, you're talking about those that sort of have a direct stake in the firm, right? There could be creditors, investors, employees, and who else have we got here? Customers. Yeah, so those people, have a direct stake in sort of the financial outcome or financial success of the firm. On the secondary side, you have people whose interest in the firm is indirect. It is through the primaries. And so that's the way that Clarkson describes this. And that's what we're trying to proxy for with the data that we have. We're trying to identify these two groups in terms of whether they have a primary status or a secondary status, right? So that's what we're trying to do here. On top of that, we have the primary, secondary, but you'll see in the literature, there's also definitions based on just the investor. And so you have the Baker et al. Paper, Hong and Harrison Hong, and then an author team, which I'm a little bit familiar with. This is Ivan and David and I and a couple of others from Spain. But what was interesting is we wrote this paper a couple of years ago, right? It was eventually published, right? We wrote it a couple of years ago. And I looked back into that paper and I think we actually were writing in that paper about the ideas that we're presenting in this paper. But I didn't realize at the time, I didn't see the connections. All right. So just to give you like a very quick overview here, we referenced in this paper the Gadjev and Giannetti paper in Review of Financial Studies. Pretty good paper. And there's a quote here that says that if ethical shareholders, right, were to remedy the managerial deficiencies from high agency costs, that can be the problem, right? High agency costs, diverting resources, making things less efficient. If they can remedy that, all right, then financial and ethical motives can go hand in hand. That is, everybody is going to be made better off. Nobody's going to lose at the expense of the other party, right? That's kind of what they're saying here. And then in our paper, we sort of build on that, and we argue that if shareholder activism, right, stakeholders wanting to see more ESG and so forth, if shareholder activism leads to pressuring firms to do something that they wouldn't otherwise do, right? But they're just doing it to keep this stakeholder group happy, right? If you get that pressure and they're doing something that would be not part of their optimal operating policies, then you get somebody being worse off because the firm is not operating in the best way possible through the activism requiring the firm to act on, say, an externality, but they wouldn't normally do that if they were unconstrained to make the best decisions for everybody. So in a sense, that's one of the issues that's going to come up in our paper here. Okay, so our definition, okay, a little bit different than the management literature, but it's along the same lines. Our definition is that every firm has at least 3 stakeholder groups. We're talking groups now. It has the primary stakeholder group, which we talked about before. It has a secondary stakeholder group, our people out there in the community and so forth. But third, it has a stakeholder group called management. And so we look at management as a stakeholder in the firm. It's a little bit different if you go to the management literature, which they tend to look at management as managers, but don't see that managers are actually agents of the stakeholders. So in that sense, they may be missing out on that element, but we are going to incorporate managers as an essential stakeholder. And the managers are going to have preferences for ESG or preferences for financial outcomes, just the same as the primary stakeholders would have preferences in the secondaries, but they're not all the same, right? There's no guarantee that the manager's preferences for ESG are going to be the same as the investor's preferences for ESG. There's no guarantee of that. We might try to align them, through contracts and relations and so forth, but there's no guarantee, at least ex post, that will actually occur. So we can define a manager's actions, right? They're going to be a function of the manager's preferences. The managers are going to act in a certain way that's going to be influenced by the stakeholders, right? The managers will act. So we've got a manager of firm J, all right? And that manager will be taking actions with regard to the preferences of the primary stakeholders, the secondary stakeholders, and the preferences of the manager, him or herself, right? So you've got this collection of preferences impacting the way the manager manages the organization. So keep in mind that the key here is that the manager has ESG preferences, and the manager is making the decisions for the firm on behalf of the outside stakeholders. Plus the manager could be making decisions for him or herself, which could be with a view to their own personal wealth.
CEO or also the CEO and the CFO and so on?
Yeah, is it the CFO, CEO? I'm looking at the manager as a generic individual here. Again, we're at the 30,000 foot level in theory at this point. So we can also maybe think about empirically, when we look at proxies for these managerial preferences, who are we actually proxying for? So it's a good question, but we would look at that from an empirical standpoint. We're not. I'll get the empirics. We're almost there. My team.
So the manager could be an owner, and so how does that work then? I mean, how do you split the manager from this?
Yeah. So the manager could be an owner.
The manager could be a bureaucrat, or it could be an owner.
So if the manager were the owner, let's say it was a sole manager, and there's only one owner, one manager, right? Then those preferences would be 100% aligned, wouldn't they? There's no chance that there could be some conflict or differential preferences, right?
Well, you haven't met my manager, but fair enough. Yeah.
Oh, we'll have to talk to Helen. Helen's the manager of another group here. Anyway, but right now at the conceptual level, we have this a single manager right, with views about the preferences of the other stakeholders, but that manager having his or her own preferences, right? So that's the sort of the setup here. And the other thing is that we have a dynamic environment. So the manager today could have preferences, but tomorrow those preferences could be different. So there's no requirement that we have to hold constant the manager's preferences or even the stakeholders' preferences, right? So we need to think about a dynamic environment here, and our tests are going to incorporate some aspects of the dynamic environment. Just to give you an idea of the extent to which stakeholder preferences can be changing, this is just the PRI membership. And PRI membership was the thing for a while. And as you can see, the membership was growing like leaps and bounds. Look what happened in the last few years. PRI membership has tailed off. The growth has tailed off. There's still adding members, but the growth has tailed off. So this is just a sign of changing ESG preferences by one stakeholder group, these being the PRI investors, right? So I'm not saying that for everybody, that this is just one sign. Okay. So the picture is 1,000 words. And this essentially represents the theory of the paper. All right, so let's follow along with this, because once we get the theory here, I think everything will sort of fall into place. So if we look at the x-axis here, all right, we're going from secondary on the left hand, at least, yeah, your left-hand side, to primary on the right. So as we emphasize primary over secondary, the expectation under the theory is that financial outcomes should improve. All right, that's what the primaries want primarily. They want the firm to succeed, to survive, right? And that's going to be measured largely in financial terms. So the expectation then is that our results should be consistent with a positive slope on the red line. Okay, the secondaries are more interested in more in ESG type outcomes or ESG non-financial outcomes. And so the secondaries should be higher on the non-financial, but as we move away from the secondaries, they should be less performance on the non-financial. And so you see the slope of the green line coming down, negative slope. All right, so that's sort of underlying what we're looking at here. We're looking for a positive slope on the red line and a negative slope on the green line. Okay, now the red line, there's actually work in the management literature, sustainability literature, that actually documents that. So the red line is not really a new result in our paper. We think the green line combined with the red line is a new result, the two taken together. All right, so that's kind of the theory of the paper. Okay, a little bit more on the theory. Managers can take pro-social actions. All right, they have the label. But managers' pro-social actions may conflict with the secondary or primary shareholders. In other words, they may go more pro-social than the primaries want. And so you've got a split in terms of the preferences. The primaries are not getting, or the managers are not performing in the way the primaries want, right? So you've got this conflict occurring. And the primaries want monetary, and they may want to achieve that at the expense of benefits or outcomes for the secondaries, right? And that's one possibility. The secondaries prefer social payoffs, which could be either fewer negative adverse outcomes or more positive. So it can go either way. So when you have these conflicts going on, that means that efforts to improve sustainability may not pay off, right? We'd like them to. That's what all the ESG CFP workers are. But our theory is that efforts to improve on ESG and produce social outcomes may not pay off, in large part because you've got these conflicts of interest. So boiling that down, it's sort of two predictions that come out of that. The owner is or could become, that's the owner, that's the secondary or primaries, could become more or less pro-social than the manager. You've got a split there. Either can create a significant conflict of interest. In scenario A, the manager becomes more pro-social than the owners want. And so you've got this conflict, and that's going to have an impact by making the primaries worse off, because they're not getting, the manager's not doing what they should be doing, right? And then the other way is the manager could become less pro-social or more financial, more monetary oriented, and that could make the secondary stakeholders worse off. So you can go either way, and one group is going to be made worse off than they would otherwise be. So that's really what we've got. We've talked about that before. Just the third bullet point there is to sort of operationalize the shifts, right? We're going to look at situations where the manager's preferences have changed from one emphasis to the other. They could go from more pro-social to more monetary, or they could go from more monetary to more pro-social. They can shift. So we can track those shifts over time from year to year based on some measures. So those are dynamic shifts. So that's pretty much saying the same thing. The primaries and primary ESG stakeholders and pro-social managers, there's going to be more ESG negative outcomes. That's going to make people worse off. Secondary stakeholders and pro-social managers, they should be benefiting from that. And the shifts, if the managers shift to more pro-social, that's going to be more negative outcomes for the primaries, and the reverse result for the secondaries if they go the other direction. Okay, so that's the kind of the theory. And there's a couple of papers in economics that sort of allude to this. We're not replicating exactly what they are, but there's some papers that show consistent analytical results along these lines. So with a theory, we need proxies, empirical proxies. Okay, so here's where we move from theory to the empirics. With the primary and secondary, we're going to go to the Refinitiv third level ESG scores. Okay, if you remember with Refinitiv, they have the three levels: environmental, social, governance, and then below that they've got the categories in each one, right? So that's what we're going for. So the primary emphasis is going to have a high Refinitiv score in the categories of governance, workforce, supplier, customers. These are sort of emphases whereby you would I guess argue that they're directly linked to the financial success or the success of the firm. On the secondaries, we're going to go into high community, high environment, high diversity, high human rights, as sort of representative of the firm or the manager's actions leaning in those directions. They have higher scores in those particular categories. So that's what we're measuring here. Each one of these, we've got some alternative proxies. We're not wedded to just one definition. So we can do some robustness on that. Okay, these Refinitiv scores are representative of the way the firm is being managed. Right, that's what they say that they are. They're representing the quality or the orientation of management. And so if those scores are moving from low primary to high secondary, that's an indication that the manager is moving to be more pro-social. If those scores are indicating that the firm is going from high primary to low secondary, that's an indication the managers are moving more to having monetary or financial outcomes in terms of the way they manage the firm. So that's measuring what management's up to, so the orientation of their decision-making on ESG issues, okay? And the outcomes, we're looking to rep risk. And if you're familiar with rep risk, it's a pretty comprehensive data set on ESG outcomes, for very large, and they measure these outcomes based on a severity score, and I think it goes from 1 to 100. So we're using the rep risk severity score as a measure of the outcome of an ESG action. All right, that's the outcome. That's the left-hand side variable, so to speak. Just to give you an idea of the variation in primary versus secondary, it's not constant over time. And you can see if we take primary minus secondary, these scores, the difference, that's the sort of the net emphasis on one direction or the other. You can see that this is the mean bouncing around, right? And you can see within every mean each year, there's quite a bit of variation, right? So if you're running empirical study, you want variation in your. That's the way you can generate, coefficients and so forth. So there's plenty of generation there. This is the sample here is all S&P 500. So US, yeah. Okay, and then just to give you another flavor descriptively for the data, if we take the primary minus secondary score, we take that score and we put it into a 1 to 5 ranking. The middle score would be a 3, right? Low would be a 1, high primary minus secondary would be a 5. Okay, so you can see that on average, these scores are around 3, but there's variation within firms each year. Okay. And then we talked about the shifts in preferences, okay? So we have 3 categories. We have firms for which there is no shift from one year to the next. We have firms for which it's a shift to pro-social, and we have firms for which it's a shift to pro-monetary, right? And the pro-monetary shifts are going to be higher, and the pro-social shifts are going to be lower on that difference. So you can see there that that's what's going on with the data. So shift to primary has a much higher primary minus secondary score. That's what you'd expect. And the shift to secondary has lower. The average for a no shift firm, which is going to be around 3, which is what you'd expect given the ranking. So we're picking up these shifts, we believe, in these changes from year to year in the rankings. Yeah.
Back to the previous slide. Can you show the slide before this one?
Oh, okay. No.
Okay. Yeah, just flip back. No, okay. Just move.
No.
Okay. Yes. Now the next.
So this is the 0. This is primary minus secondary is 0. This is the absolute score, not the ranking. So when I move to this one, I'm ranking them.
Yeah.
Right. So this is just the numerical score here.
But it's noticeable that 2009, 10, and so these are post global financial crisis years, where you would see more.
Martin is saying, can we extract a little bit more information from this trend here, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, it's a very valid point. It may be that when we have financial crises, right, you get a shift here, right? I think that's kind of where you're headed with the question.
And then in 16, 17, 18, that is Trump. The mood shifts.
Martin said that I think they said that might be. How about that? How about a hypothesis? And adding controls for everything else. So that it's possible, but we're not at this point of doing some sort of intervention, or maybe like an advanced study or something like that. So, but it's something that obviously we could think about. Okay, so now the models, it's a standard panel regression setup, right? Panel design over the years and over the sample. We have I think about 3,500 sort of firm year observations, maybe 3,600 firm year observations. And the models are, as you can see there, on the left-hand side, we have the outcome, right, of variable, which is the measure of negative incidence through breakfast. And in addition, we run this same data through violation tracker, and I'll get to that in a minute. So we've done a robustness on that. So with the primary, we're expecting a positive coefficient. That is, if you're emphasizing primary, with manager emphasizing the primary stakeholders in decision making, they're more concerned about financial, and they're less concerned about non-financial. So we're expecting the rep risk incidence to be higher. That is more negative, more adverse. Right. So the positive coefficients means that when you emphasize primary, you get more adverse rep risk incidence. When you emphasize secondary, you get fewer rep risk adverse incidents. Right. So that's the setup here. And of course, we can also run it on the difference between primary minus secondary. And on the difference, we simply expect a positive coefficient for beta 1. That is, the relative amount of primary minus secondary should increase the number of rep risk incidents, which are adverse incidents.
Oh, this is equally weighted or value weighted for market values. So the top 10 companies are quite different to some of the other companies. Is that causing a problem? And the other one is the oil and gas. So it used to be S&P 500 is oil and gas, but now it's not longer oil and gas. And so oil and gas is quite different to other stakeholder.
We could look at. I've got a table on the mix of the sample. Yes. We could see that. But the other thing you can do in a design like that, we can run, which we do, firm fixed effects to try to cover any sort of any sort of longer term industry or firm level impacts.
Top 10 are basically Microsoft. Or the beta.
We got almost 20 years of data here, so we're not picking up the sort of the tech anymore. It's something we've looked at, but maybe we need to look at further.
Thank you.
Okay. So these are the coefficients. So the dynamic effect, if you're shifting to less pro-social, that means that the primaries should be worse off, and then we expect more incidents because the manager's deviating from what the primaries want. Right, so we expect a positive coefficient. Okay, here's the sample makeup. Energy, you can see with the energy is it's not a big component here. Then it's an S&P 500. The numbers are smaller than 500 because rep risk is not picking up every firm and every year. So that's the reason for that. So we don't put if it's not on rep risk, we don't put it as a zero incident. All right. So we have to have an incident at least of some measure to be able to sample.
2007 is only 112 S&P 500.
We're getting 200 to 300 versus 500.
Yeah,
but that's because we're not picking it up through reference.
Yeah, I understand the issue, but it is a bit of an issue because it might be the top 100 compared to the bottom.
Well, it could be the ones that didn't make it the rep risk. These are all the cleanest firms, right? But if they're really super clean firms, it's going to weaken our result, right? Because they won't be reacting, or they'll be reacting in the most optimal way, right? There's not they've avoided these conflicts. So but that's an analysis we could do is put in the non-rep risks, have the full S&P, but they would have to have a zero.
Yes.
The problem is that when you think about a distribution, you've got 300 with numbers, and you've got a whole bunch of zero, and that's kind of a weird distribution something. So you have to think about those things.
I think around 2013 onwards, it's much better with the sample things.
Yes. Yeah, you can see what
About 2013 is much better.
yeah, exactly. No, that's right. And that's partly reference
Yeah.
because I hadn't been around that.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is our first regression result. Okay. And we've got the two stakeholder variables in there, and you can see there that when firms show a interest in secondary shareholder preferences, that there's a correlation that indicates that they will have a fewer negative incidents. So that's the negative coefficient there minus T is 2.34. That's indicative of there being fewer rep risk incidents when the management orientation is more towards secondary versus primary. It's not exclusive one or the other, it's just weighted more on one or the other. Okay. Now, there's also a little bit of an econometric issue here, and that is when you look at the primary and the secondary scores, a firm with a high primary tends to be a firm with a high secondary. Right? So, and that little picture there is the correlation between primary and secondary. Right. So when you run a regression, you've got some serial correlation in those two variables, and sometimes the regressions will take care of that, right, through partials and so forth. But the other way to do it is rather than have the two variables there that we don't see that correlated, we'll just put in the difference. Right. And that's just a way of handling that issue. So if we run it the same regression on the difference, we're still expecting a positive coefficient. And that's what we get. You can see there that the primary secondary difference is positive. That is, if there's more emphasis by the managers on primary versus secondary, relatively, there's going to be more negative incidents, more negative ESG incidents as measured by records.
The dependent variable, environmental social governance, it's going to be environmental and social rather than governance.
Okay, yeah. That's another way to look at the DV here. Okay, right now it's just a rep risk that we can go, as David said, we can go into rep risk and say, well, let's look at environmental incidents and let's look at social incidents, right? And let's see if there's any sort of differential coefficient on those particular incidents. So the point is well made. As I said, this is first presentation. There's many things that we can do, and that's certainly what you wanted to look at. Assuming that we can figure out from breakfast, what the nature of the incident is. That may not be that easy, but I can't tell you the answer on that. Okay. And then what about the shift? Remember, I talked about the shift. If the management is shifting to pro-social, right? They should be getting a better. The secondary should be getting a better deal, right? But if the manager is shifting to pro-social and the primaries don't like it, then they're not going to be well served, right? So you can see what's happening there. You get that shift to pro-social. The secondaries love it. They've got fewer negative rep risks, even negative coefficient. The primaries do not like it because the managers now deviated from what the primaries want, right? That's the conflict. And then this is our effort in the line interest and so forth. And that's going to generate a higher coefficient. Now, what's interesting about that is that if you look at the secondary, that's a 0.19 coefficient, right? Just keep that one 0.19. And we go back to let's see, go back to here. In a non-change situation, it's only 0.04. So in those change situations where you have much more likelihood that you really do have a conflict of interest, the coefficient is higher, which we would get.
Yeah, just to make sure that I understand correctly, the primary stakeholder and the secondary stakeholder.
Just please.
Sure.
Yeah.
If I just make sure that I understand correctly, the primary stakeholder refers to the refinitive. Your primary stakeholder refers to the refinitive primary scores, and the secondary stakeholder refers to the refinitive the third of second or third level scores. Is that correct?
Somebody help me with the question. He's asking how you measure primary stakeholders, secondary stakeholders.
Not just how to measure, that's the refinitive third level category score.
Okay.
It's from refinitive.
All right. Okay. Thanks. This is correct. Thanks. Thank you.
Different things for different.
Yeah. If you look
Human
at
rights,
if you look at the refinitive triangle, right, you'll see that there's the E and the G at the top, and then you go one level down. And that's what we're looking at. There's the category scores within E, within G, and so yeah. So that's the data source we're using. I think refinitive is generally viewed as a good data source. Some of the early work on primary secondaries used MSCI, or back in the old days it was K or K L. Yeah. So that's what we're using. Okay, so. And then if we go in the other direction, we're looking to see whether those coefficients reverse. The signs reverse, but we're not getting significance. In other words, when we assume that the managers are now working much more in line with what the primaries want, they're shifting, right? We're not seeing a very strong reduction in incidents relating, for the primary group, for those firms that emphasize primary. But the signs are the same, and maybe this is a power issue. We don't know that we're not getting this equivalent significance going in the other direction. Okay, all right. So that's our story with the non-financial incidents. Right. So the natural thing then is to ask the question, well, how does this work relate to those prior studies that I talked about that identify that the returns, the financial returns are higher for primaries and market value of the firms higher and lower the secondary. So how does it relate to that prior work? Right. So we'd like that to be the case. So what we do here is we're going to regress ROA on the left-hand side on incidence and the ESG emphasis. Okay. Now we put in the incidence because if there's an incident, we would expect the firm, the ROA to go down, right? These are negative incidents, so we'd expect that. And you can see there that it's not very clear, but you can see that the coefficient is positive, but not significant. But the ROA is significant. That is, the ROA is higher when you have an emphasis on primary versus secondary. This is ROA. So incidents go up when it's primary versus secondary, but ROA also goes up. Right, so that's where you have these two offsetting outcomes essentially. Yeah.
Is this because of the profit margin or the asset turnover ratio?
This is simply ROA, return on
I
assets.
understand, but is it because of the profit margin or is it through the asset turnover ratios?
You can't really see this, but we've controlled for efficiency.
Now, efficiency, that's the profit margin and asset turnover are the base for the return on assets.
We'll say, yeah,
So it's
I understand ROA has components.
components,
Right.
yes.
Right, but in some of these components we already have, I mean, like for efficient, if you're a more efficient firm, and maybe that's a turnover, it could be turnover related, right? You get more turnover.
You can't then do the dependent variable and the independent variable is an issue there. Because the asset
I get the
turnover
point.
ratio is.
I understand that there's multiple ways to do this, but if you look at the efficiency variable, you'd expect firms to be more efficient. Maybe that's, sales to assets, that could be a measure. You'd expect firms to be more efficient, right? Well, it's got a positive sign on that control. So in a sense, that ROA has controlled for differential efficiency. Right? But there's, I grant you there's other ways to set up this. But anyway, so with the larger firms, we've got a negative coefficient, so it tends to be the smaller firms more likely to have higher ROA than the larger firms. I think that's probably a reasonably accepted result. You see that. Anyway, so that's the result, and here is what I think is a kind of a nice result. At least it makes sense to us. Is that we've shown in the ESG analysis the green trend, right? The more emphasis you have on secondary versus primary, the greater the reduction in ESG, right? So with the secondaries, you expect it to be better off, so you should see a larger reduction, right? So that's, you just have to sort of translate that around. With the secondaries, however, they get the larger reduction in incidence, that's good for them, at the expense of lower ROA. And then the reversal. So that's the empirical equivalent of that, of the little graph that I showed you earlier on of the theory. So the results, in a sense, supporting the theory here. Okay, so I'm almost done here. As I said, we looked at violation tracker as an equivalent measure of outcomes, right? And here we had to do one other thing, is that when you look at violation tracker, there's two measures. There's a dollar value of the penalty, and then there's an indication, was there an action or not? Right, there's just two measures. And so what we had to do here is that we couldn't use it on a firm year basis because there's so few, maybe only one per year, and you go along and there's nothing going on. So we run the regressions on a firm level basis. So we looked at the number of violation tracker events per firm, right? And the penalties per firm, right? So we run the regression on a per firm basis, and you can see that we get basically the same coefficients associated with our primary versus secondary emphasis. And if you just look empirically at the trends as a function of whether it's a secondary emphasis or a primary emphasis going from 1 to 5, you can see that those trends are pretty much tracking each other. So the violation tracker data support the rep risk data. But if you think about it, there should be nothing unusual about that because rep risk is picking up violation tracker data. It's the same thing, right? They're picking up all these health and safety violations and so forth. So that was reassuring from a sort of robustness standpoint. So I'm going to wind up now. The contributions. Contribution number 1 we're adding to the management literature by showing differential non-financial impacts depending on a primary or secondary stakeholder. So there's a non-financial impacts. Number two, we add to the sustainability literature by documenting results that explain why and in what circumstances manage this policy to promote sustainability can fail or backfire. Right. And then third, we add to the accounting literature by documenting findings relevant to standard sets efforts to expand disclosure of non-financial items. And we're showing that these non-financial items actually do matter. Right? Although we're showing that they matter with numbers that are coming out of a non-financial report, right? So you could argue that because we show them they're relevant, there should be more emphasis of these measures in financial reports, which they're not, right? Because most managers don't feel they're material, they don't disclose. I just want to say thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Any other contributions?
How do you calculate ROAs? Return on assets with the lagged assets.